Close your eyes for a moment. Picture a chair. Not a throne of gold and jewels, not a seat of power gleaming under cathedral lights in some grand ceremonial hall. Picture something ancient, something that hums with the sound of a machine that should have broken 10,000 years ago. Picture cables as thick as a human torso, writhing like the veins of something barely alive, each one threading into the next, bundled together in configurations that suggest an intelligence behind them, even as that intelligence has been forgotten for generations. Picture the smell of ozone and incense and something else underneath all of it, something organic, something that should not still be present in a place of so much metal and stone, something that speaks to the presence of flesh that has been preserved far past the point at which flesh typically consents to continue. Picture the sound of machines that have not stopped running in 10,000 years, maintained by hands that do not fully understand what they are maintaining, kept alive by prayers and rituals that have substituted for genuine technical knowledge over the centuries. Picture a space large enough to hold 6 fully equipped Space Marine companies, vast and echoing, and lit with a quality of light that seems to come from the throne itself. That golden radiance bleeding into every corner of the chamber and laying itself across the faces of the golden warriors who stand eternal watch along its walls. And in the center of all that machinery and light and ceremonial weight, barely visible beneath the cables and the conduits and the mechanisms of survival, is a figure. Once, that figure stood taller than most men. Once, those hands now skeletal, now barely present beneath the mechanisms sustaining them, created 20 demigods from his own genetic material. Once, that mind conceived a plan that was meant to carry humanity out of 10,000 years of darkness and into a future where the stars belong to the human race, where disease and ignorance and the cruelty of the supernatural would be set aside in favor of something rational and enduring and truly worth building. Once, that voice inspired legions. That gaze, it is said, could strip apart a soul and see everything inside it clearly. Every fear, every selfish impulse, every buried kindness, every secret ambition, and still find a reason to keep fighting, to keep trying. Now, the body is barely there, withered, ancient, held together not by biology, but by sheer will, and by a machine that no one alive fully understands. The flesh has decayed past the point where it could sustain any ordinary form of life. The features are barely recognizable as human. The light that shines from what remains is not reflected. It comes from somewhere inside what is left, from whatever has refused, with a stubbornness that borders on the terrifying, to simply let go. This is the Emperor of mankind, master of mankind, the God Emperor to hundreds of billions who have never seen his face and never will, who know him only through the sermons of priests who are themselves 600 generations removed from anyone who knew him in life. He has not moved in 10,000 years. He has not spoken in 10,000 years. And yet without him, humanity and perhaps the entire galaxy would already be gone. Every faction in the Warhammer 40,000 universe is aware of the Emperor at some level. The Chaos Gods call him the Anathema, the greatest embodiment of ordered will in the material universe, the single consciousness most opposed to their nature. The Eldar, those ancient, dying aliens who built the webway and whose fall birthed one of those very chaos gods, have their own complicated relationship with him. Their seers, having watched his psychic presence in the warp grow and change over 10,000 years in ways that their finest minds are still debating. Even the Necrons, those ancient machines who disdain everything psychic, have been forced to acknowledge the Emperor's existence as a factor in their calculations for the galaxy's future. Let us start with what the Golden Throne actually is, because understanding it is absolutely essential to understanding why his return would be the single most consequential event in the history of the setting. And because the difference between what it was built to be and what it became is one of the great tragedies of this universe, the Golden Throne is not, at its core, a throne in any ceremonial sense. It was discovered by the Emperor in the ruins of an earlier civilization, exactly which one remains unclear, with some accounts suggesting it dates to the dark age of technology and others implying it may be older still and extensively rebuilt to serve his purposes. The original structure was a control device for a gateway, a portal into the network of psychic tunnels the ancient Eldar had carved through the fabric of reality itself, the tunnels we know as the Webway, a route through which matter and information could travel without entering the warp, without exposing travelers to the demonic presence that lurks within the immaterium. The Emperor's plan, the one he retreated from the Great Crusade to pursue in secret, the one he refused to explain to his sons or his commanders, or anyone who questioned his withdrawal from active leadership, was to give humanity access to the Webway. Not a partial access, not the limited sliver of it that humans had previously managed to utilize through Eldar tolerance or blind luck, but full, sovereign, human access. An infrastructure that belonged to humanity, that required no warp exposure, no navigators, no Geller fields, no risk of demonic contamination on every voyage between the stars. Consider what that would have meant. Instantaneous movement across the galaxy without the nightmares bleeding through from the other side. Trade and communication and military coordination without the weeks or months of travel through the warp that currently makes governing a galaxy-spanning empire into a logistical nightmare of almost comical proportions. A future where humanity could develop and expand without the warp as both the road that connects everything and the predator that hunts everything on that road simultaneously. It was breathtakingly ambitious. It was, many argue, the only plan that could have truly secured humanity's survival in any meaningful long-term sense. The Great Crusade was winning battles, reconnecting worlds, pushing back the darkness, but it was doing so using the warp as its highway, and the warp was always going to extract its price eventually. Then Magnus the Red, the most gifted psychic of all the Emperor's sons, shattered the project with a single act of desperation. Magnus had learned of Horus's corruption. He had received visions, genuine and terrible, of what the War Master was planning. In his desperation to warn his father in his love for the Emperor and for the Imperium he served, he used sorcery to send a psychic message directly to Terra, bypassing the careful protocols the Emperor had established, breaking through the wards protecting the Webway project with the full force of his extraordinary mind. The wards cracked. The carefully constructed psychic barriers the Emperor had spent years building, that he maintained through constant personal effort from the seat of the Golden Throne, fractured and gave way. Daemons poured through the breach. Not a handful, not a manageable incursion, but a tide entities from across the warp flooding into the tunnel system, filling the corridors beneath the Imperial Palace, with the manifested nightmares of the Immaterium, pressing toward the surface of Terra from below. The Emperor had to seal it with himself. His own psychic power, directed from the throne, became the wall between the Daemon tide and the surface of the most important world in human history. And when he was dragged off that throne to face Horus by circumstances that were themselves part of the Chaos God's plan and was carried back to it afterwards, broken beyond any healer's art, the machine was converted from a Webway control device into something else entirely. A life support system, a psychic amplifier, a prison with golden walls and 10,000 years of ceremony built up around it. To keep him alive, to keep the Astronomicon burning that great psychic beacon projected from Terra that allows human ships to navigate the warp, the fixed star by which every navigator in the Imperium sets their course. The Imperium feeds him. Every single day, approximately 1,000 psychers are brought before the Golden Throne in the vast dungeon halls beneath the Imperial Palace and sacrificed. Their souls are consumed. Their psychic essence is absorbed into the Emperor's vast but fading consciousness, providing fuel for his continued existence and for the light that guides human ships through the most dangerous dimension in the universe. 1,000 souls, every day, for 10,000 years. Let us not gloss past that number, because it deserves to be felt. 1,000 human beings, every single day. People with the psychic gift who were gathered from worlds across the Imperium by the black ships of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, brought to Terra in chains or in reverent submission, and consumed by a machine that keeps a dying man alive so that the rest of humanity can navigate between the stars. Over the course of a single year, that is over 365,000 human lives. Over a century, that number exceeds 36 million. Over the full 10,000 years of the Emperor's internment, the total number of souls sacrificed to sustain him, just the formal, official sacrifices at the throne, not counting the countless other lives spent in service to the Imperium in his name, is a number that defies easy comprehension. It is not a number. It is a civilization's worth of people, an entire world's population consumed every few years, an ongoing ritual of sacrifice so vast and so ancient that the Imperium has built a theological framework around it to make it bearable. The black ships are always sailing. They have been sailing for 10 millennia, pulling into port at worlds across the Imperium, identifying the psychically gifted through methods the Adeptus Astra Telepathica has refined over generations, and taking them, some are soul-bound into service as astropaths, their minds linked to the Emperor's in a ritual that costs them their sight, but grants them the ability to send psychic communications across interstellar distances. Some are trained as sanctioned psychers and sent to serve in the Imperium's armies, but many, very many, end their journey on Terra, in the halls beneath the palace, adding their light to the fire that keeps the last ember of the Emperor's existence burning. And here's the thing that makes this already bleak reality significantly bleaker. The quota is rising. The Golden Throne is failing. This is not speculation or fan theory invented to create drama. It is established lore, woven into the foundational narrative of the setting across decades of sourcebooks, novels, and codices. The ancient mechanisms are deteriorating. The tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus, who maintain the device, barely understand what they are working with. The rituals they perform are cargo cult repetitions of processes that were once actually understood actions performed by rote, because no one alive knows what would happen if they stopped, even if what they are doing no longer achieves what it was originally designed to achieve. The original tech priests who worked on the conversion of the throne at the end of the heresy had knowledge that has since been lost. Their successors learned by watching their predecessors, memorizing sequences of action without grasping the underlying principles. Those successors taught their own students the same way, and so on, generation after generation, a chain of inherited procedure stretching back 10,000 years, with no way to check the chain against the original source. Layer upon layer of ritual has accumulated over genuine technical understanding, like geological sediment burying an original landscape, until the current generation of priests tending the throne are essentially performing elaborate ceremonies around equipment they could not rebuild from scratch or even fully diagnose. The consequence of this degradation is measurable. The number of psychers required daily to sustain the same level of output has been growing, slowly but consistently, as the throne's efficiency declines. The estimate of 1,000 per day is a rough figure. Historical records suggest the original requirement was somewhat lower, and current projections suggest it will need to be higher still as the deterioration continues. There is a point somewhere in the future. Estimates vary, and the Adeptus Mechanicus does not publicize their calculations at which the throne's capacity to sustain the Emperor will fall below what any number of psyker sacrifices can compensate for. When that point arrives, the Astronomicon goes dark. Every human ship in the warp will lose the one fixed psychic reference point they depend on. Navigators, those mutant humans whose third eye allows them to perceive the warp while in it, will find themselves adrift in a storm with no landmarks. Fleets will become lost in the tides of the immaterium, trapped, consumed, or driven mad. Supply lines will collapse. Armies will find themselves stranded on distant worlds with no way to be reinforced or resupplied. The Imperium of Man, already struggling under the weight of simultaneous wars on 1,000 fronts, already divided by the Great Rift that has split the galaxy in half, will begin to fracture world by world, cut off from each other, consumed by the darkness that has been patient enough to wait this long. And in the dungeons beneath the Imperial Palace, whatever remains of a warrior who once dreamed of saving his species will finally, after 10,000 years of agony and effort and unbroken will, be permitted to stop. Unless something changes. That is the question that haunts every corner of this lore. That is the question we are going to spend today, exploring from every angle, following every thread, examining every theory the setting has offered across decades of stories. What happens if the Emperor returns? But before we can understand what his return would mean, we need to understand who he actually was, because the answer to that question shapes everything that follows. If you are watching this right now, wherever you are in the world, Drop a comment below and tell me where you are and what time it is there. I love seeing how far this community reaches across the planet. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is a great time. We go deep on 40,000 lore here, and there is a great deal more on the way. Here is something that gets lost in the mythology that grew up around him across 10,000 years of imperial worship. Something buried beneath the weight of the God-Emperor title and the cathedral iconography and the theological volumes. The emperor was not always ancient. He was not born old and divine and terrible. He had a childhood. He had a home. He learned and grew and made mistakes and changed his mind about things and walked through human history wearing a dozen different faces across a span of time, so long that the earliest phases of his existence are now legend, even within the setting's own framework for understanding the past. He was born somewhere in Anatolia, in the region we would now call Turkey, somewhere around 8,000 years before the Common Era. A single human child, gifted from the moment of his earliest awareness, with a quality of mind and a breadth of perception that had no comparison among any of his contemporaries. He experienced the world through senses that other people simply did not possess. He could perceive the psychic dimension of existence, the warp, that parallel reality of emotion and nightmare and desire, as easily as he perceived the physical one. He could read the hidden emotional and psychological landscape of every person he encountered. He could see patterns in events that others experienced as random. He could, in ways that he learned to be careful about revealing, influence the world around him in directions that others would not have been able to explain. His kind have a name in the lore, a name that the Horus Heresy novel series formalized after decades of the concept hovering at the edges of the setting's mythology. They are called perpetuals. And a perpetual is not simply a person who lives a long time. That description captures the fact of it without capturing any of the texture. A perpetual is something distinct from baseline humanity, a mutation or perhaps an expression of a deeper evolutionary potential, beings who are effectively immortal because their bodies continuously regenerate. They heal from injuries that would be instantly lethal to ordinary humans. They grow through youth and into physical maturity, and then stop aging at some point determined by their specific nature. They die, sometimes, in circumstances severe enough to overcome even their extraordinary recovery injuries that are too total, in contexts where the psychic mechanism of regeneration is specifically disrupted, but they come back. The body rebuilds itself over time. The consciousness resurfaces from wherever it retreated to during the interruption. Death is for them not a permanent ending, but a profound interruption, traumatic and disorienting, and sometimes experienced as a form of grief, but ultimately temporary. The Emperor was the greatest perpetual who ever lived, and he was in a category essentially apart from all the others. His psychic capability was orders of magnitude beyond what any other perpetual demonstrated. His rate of physical regeneration was faster and more complete. His cognitive capacity, the speed of his thought, the depth of his analysis, the breadth of what he could hold in his attention simultaneously had no comparison. He was not just the greatest human to ever live. He was, in some meaningful sense, a different order of being who happened to have originated from human material. He was not alone, though. Other perpetuals walked through history alongside him across the millennia, occasionally crossing his path, sometimes working with him, sometimes arguing with him, sometimes working against plans he had laid with a patience and a scope of vision they found unsettling. He accumulated knowledge across thousands of years. He studied every human civilization that rose and fell within his observation. He absorbed every religion, every philosophy, every approach to governance and warfare and social organization that humanity had ever devised. He conducted long experiments with human societies, sometimes guiding them from positions of influence, sometimes taking more direct action. And through all of it, he was building towards something, a goal so long in the making, so complex in its dependencies, so far-sighted in its understanding of humanity's trajectory and the threats that would eventually need to be faced, that conveying it to any individual he might have tried to explain it to would have required them to first acquire several centuries of background knowledge just to follow the basic shape of the argument. The goal was survival. The survival of the human species against threats that the Emperor could see developing while they were still distant enough that almost no one else could perceive them clearly. The warp was growing more dangerous as humanity's collective psychic presence in the immaterium grew stronger. The connection between human emotion and warp energy was not a mystical abstract. It was a real, measurable, physical relationship, and it meant that as humanity proliferated and developed and expanded across the galaxy, it was simultaneously feeding something it did not know existed and creating vulnerabilities in itself that it did not know to guard against. He had watched what happened to the Eldar, not in the abstract, not from historical records he had been alive when the Eldar civilization began its long decline, had watched from a distance as a species of extraordinary psychic power, built an empire and then destroyed it from within, through excess and pride and the refusal to acknowledge the consequences of what their collective mind was generating in the warp. The fall of the Eldar, the catastrophic psychic implosion that birthed Slaanesh, one of the four great chaos gods, and consumed the majority of an ancient species in a single apocalyptic event, was something the Emperor had witnessed at the edge of his perception and had understood and had spent considerable time thinking about in terms of what it implied for humanity's own trajectory. He did not want that for his species. He was not willing to allow it. So he planned. For thousands of years, through dozens of lives and hundreds of identities, he planned and prepared. He intervened in specific historical moments when the stakes were high enough to justify the risk of exposure. He allowed some catastrophes that he might have prevented, calculating that the interference required would cost more than the catastrophe. He watched empires rise and fall and drew lessons from each of them, assembling a model of what a human civilization capable of genuine long-term survival would need to look like, what structural features it would require, what cultural values and institutional arrangements would allow it to endure rather than collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. And then, roughly in the 30th millennium of the calendar that would eventually bear his Imperium's stamp, he stepped out of the shadows at last and began to act directly. The unification wars on Old Earth were brutal and grinding and extended over years of conflict, fought across every environment the planet offered, against warlords and tyrants and the petty fiefdoms that had carved up Old Earth in the absence of any unifying power. The Emperor fought them himself, often at the front of his armies, because the Emperor of the Great Crusade was never a distant administrator or a remote commander. He was a warrior of extraordinary and terrifying capability, armored in gold, wielding psychic power and physical force in combination with a tactical genius that had been refined over millennia of observation and practice. The companions he gathered around himself in this period, the warriors who became the Custodian Guard, the first Space Marines, the Thunder Warriors who preceded them, were chosen and shaped with care. The Primarchs he created were themselves a kind of crystallized plan. 20 beings engineered from his own genetic material, each one designed to embody and extend a specific set of human capabilities to their absolute limit. Robert Guillemot's administrative genius, which allowed him to build and govern an empire of 500 worlds from his homeworld of Macragge with a precision that the entire administratum still cannot match. Rogaldorn's mastery of siege and fortification, the mind that built the defenses of the imperial palace. Sanguinius's beauty and warrior grace, and the prophetic gifts that whispered at the edges of his consciousness. Magnus the Red's psychic power and insatiable intellectual hunger. Lorgar's faith and oratorical gift, which the Emperor intended to redirect toward the imperial truth, and instead found itself redirected toward something far more dangerous. Each Primarch was a tool, yes, but also a person, a mind that developed and grew beyond what the Emperor had designed, that formed loyalties and preferences and ambitions and wounds that he had not entirely anticipated. This is the source of the tragedy of the heresy, ultimately, the gap between the Emperor's design and the living, feeling beings who inherited that design and had to live inside it. He created weapons and they became sons, and he never fully made the transition in his own understanding from thinking about them as instruments to thinking about them as people who needed to be seen clearly and treated accordingly. The Great Crusade, at its height, was humanity's most glorious military and exploratory achievement. 200 Space Marine legions, each numbering in the tens of thousands, spreading across the galaxy under their Primarch commanders, reconnecting the lost worlds of humanity, bringing them back into a civilization defined in the emperor's original vision by rationality, secular governance, scientific inquiry, and freedom from the supernatural fears that had haunted human history since before the emperor's own birth. This was the imperial truth, and it is deeply, crucially important for understanding what the emperor's return would mean, because the imperial truth and the reality the Imperium has become over 10,000 years are not simply different. They are almost exact ideological opposites. The imperial truth was secular, rational, anti-religious in a specific and intentional sense, not from prejudice, but from strategic calculation. The emperor understood from millennia of direct observation, and from his intimate familiarity with how the warp actually functions, that worship empowers the entities of the immaterium. The chaos gods feed on devotion. Prayer directed at a being of the warp is not merely symbolically significant, it is a genuine transfer of psychic energy, a contribution to the power of the being worshipped. Every temple built, every prayer said, every act of faith directed at a warp entity made that entity stronger and gave it a greater foothold in the material universe. If humanity could be guided away from superstition, the chaos gods would be starved. If the trillions of human minds spread across the galaxy could be oriented toward rational inquiry rather than supernatural faith, the warp itself would be calmer, safer, less hospitable to the predators who lurked within it. This was not, in the emperor's understanding, a nice philosophical preference. It was a survival strategy, possibly the only survival strategy that would work long enough to matter. Then Horus fell, and the heresy burned through the galaxy. And then the emperor was broken, and the plan was broken with him, and everything he had built was left in the hands of people who did not fully understand what they had been given or why it had been built the way it had. To understand what the emperor's return would mean, you have to sit with what was done to him, not skim past it, not summarize it in a sentence, and move on. Sit with the specific, terrible particularity of what Horus did to his father in the throne room of the vengeful spirit, because those wounds are the thing that have kept the emperor on the golden throne for 10,000 years. And understanding their nature is understanding the obstacle that any theory of his return must overcome. The Horus heresy itself had been building for years before the siege of Terra. Horus Lupercal, the emperor's first-named son and greatest general, his war master, the being he trusted more than any other of his children to embody the spirit of the Great Crusade and carry it forward, when the emperor withdrew to Terra to work on his Webway project, had been corrupted by the 4 chaos gods working in concert. The mechanism of that corruption is complex, involving a wound on the world of Davin and a trance state orchestrated by the ruinous powers. But the core of it was an insight. Horus was given to see a possible future, a false vision presented as truth, in which the emperor elevated himself to divine status and discarded his sons once they had served their purpose. The tragedy is that the vision was almost right about everything except its most important claim. The emperor was planning to leave his sons behind, but not to abandon them. He was working toward a point at which his Webway project would be complete and humanity would no longer need him in the same way, at which he could step back from direct governance and allow the species he had spent his life preparing to stand on its own. The vision twisted this into betrayal. Horus, already the greatest military mind in the galaxy, already carrying the weight of commanding the Great Crusade, while his father was silent and absent in ways Horus found both painful and confusing, believed it. And in believing it, he fell. By the time the heresy reached Terra, it had consumed half of the Space Marine legions, multiple Primarchs, either dead or corrupted, entire star systems burned in the fighting. The siege of the Imperial Palace lasted weeks. The defenders, led by Rogaldorn and Sanguinius, held the walls at cost that cannot be easily calculated. Sanguinius was killed by Horus before the Emperor's arrival on the vengeful spirit, another wound that the Emperor would carry into his confrontation with his son, another death that he had failed to prevent. The confrontation itself happened on multiple levels simultaneously, in ways that make any simple physical description inadequate. Physically, the Emperor teleported onto the vengeful spirit with a small strike force that was largely destroyed in the approach. Psychically, the confrontation occurred in the warp as much as in real space, two beings of enormous power clashing in the immaterium. The fight between their souls, every bit as important as the fight between their bodies. Horus had dropped his ship's Geller field. The raw, unfiltered warp flooded the vengeful spirit, and what the warp contains does not spare the merely mortal. Warriors of the Emperor's finest were torn apart by things that should not exist, by the pure, concentrated nightmare of the immaterium, given momentary form by the absence of the field that normally kept them at bay. When the Emperor and Horus finally faced each other, the power differential should have been overwhelming in the Emperor's favor. Horus was extraordinary, the greatest of the Primarchs, elevated further by 10,000 years' worth of chaos blessings accumulated across the souls of those who had dedicated their lives and deaths to the dark gods. But the Emperor was the Emperor. He had been preparing for this his entire life, in some sense, had spent millennia becoming the thing that could stand in this place and face this threat and win. But the Emperor did not immediately win, because the Emperor could not bring himself to strike with full force against his most beloved son. The accounts of the battle are fragmentary and disputed and mythologized, but the emotional core of them is consistent. The Emperor loved Horus, even corrupted, even monstrous. Even wielding the power of chaos undivided against everything, the Emperor had spent his existence building. Horus was still his son. The Emperor could see, when he looked at the thing that had worn Horus's face and committed atrocity in Horus's name, the person that Horus had been before the corruption. And that person, that brilliant and vital and deeply beloved individual, deserved better than to be used as a vehicle for the very powers that had always threatened humanity. The Emperor held back, and Horus did not. What Horus did to the Emperor in those moments is described in various sources as damage that went beyond the merely physical. Not simply wounds of the body, grievous as those were, but wounds of the soul, attacks directed simultaneously at the Emperor's physical form and at his presence in the warp, the psychic dimension of his being, the part of him that extended into the immaterium and held the demonic tide at bay and maintained the Astronomican's light. Horus, with the full power of the chaos gods channeled through him, struck at the Emperor's consciousness itself, aiming to destroy not just the body, but the mind and the soul and the will that had stood against the darkness for 40,000 years. The Emperor felt his sons dying. He had always been able to sense his children. The Primarchs were extensions of him in a real and not merely symbolic sense, and their deaths registered in his perception as losses that a being of lesser constitution might not have survived experiencing. He had felt Sanguinius die. He had felt the corruption eating at the others over years of the heresy. And now he felt himself dying by degrees, each wound Horus inflicted taking something from him that could not simply be replaced. At the end, something saved him. Or rather, the Emperor saved himself in a way that cost everything remaining to him to accomplish. Horus clearly saw through the corruption to the moment of clarity underneath, that fraction of a second in which the War Master existed again, unclouded and horrified at what he had become. And in that moment, with that understanding, he struck. Not a blow of war. Something more final. He reached into the corruption and he tore it out. And in tearing it out, he destroyed Horus so completely that no trace of the War Master remained. No soul to be retrieved and reconstituted. No essence preserved in the warp. Just nothing. Where one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy had been. The cost of that final act was everything that remained. Rogel Dorn found his father on the floor of the vengeful spirit's throne room and held him and understood, with the cold, strategic clarity that was both his gift and his curse, that there was no saving what remained. There was only preserving it, for as long as possible, in hopes that a real solution might eventually present itself. 10,000 years later, that solution has not yet presented itself, and the wounds that were dealt in that room continue to define the setting, continue to drive every story that has been written in the aftermath, continue to sit at the center of every question about what the Imperium is and what it could become. In the years immediately following the heresy, the Imperium looked like what it was, the survivor of a war that had almost destroyed it entirely. The defending armies were shattered. The traitor legions had retreated into the Eye of Terror, but retreated is the wrong word, because it implies a defeat, when what actually happened was more like a strategic withdrawal, by forces that had achieved many of their goals and chosen to consolidate their gains. Cadia still stood. The eye was contained, but the damage to the Imperium was beyond anything that could be quickly repaired. The Primarchs who survived the heresy were, each in their own way, beginning to be lost. Sanguinius was dead, Horus was dead, Ferrus Manus was dead, the traitors were gone into the eye, and the Loyalists, who had fought for years across the galaxy to reach Terra in time to matter, were diminished in ways that combat could not fully account for. Something of the Great Crusade spirit had died with the heresy. The optimism, the sense that humanity was actually winning and that the future was bright, that quality had been replaced by something grimmer and more defensive and more suspicious. Robert Guillemot wrote the Codex Astartes. This document, which reorganized the remaining Space Marine legions into hundreds of smaller chapters, each numbering no more than 1,000 warriors, has been interpreted in various ways across the setting's history. The stated rationale preventing any single commander from assembling a force large enough to threaten Terra is sometimes characterized as paranoia or overcaution. But Guillemot, the most politically and strategically sophisticated of the surviving Primarchs, understood something fundamental about the challenge the Imperium faced going forward. The tools that had won the Great Crusade could also destroy what had been won. The resulting structure, hundreds of independent chapters, each with their own culture and history and interpretation of the Codex, spread across the galaxy and answerable to a complex web of obligations to various institutions, is simultaneously the Imperium's most impressive military asset and one of its most significant coordination failures. Any individual chapter is extraordinary. Multiple chapters working together toward the same objective is achievable, but requires effort and negotiation. The entire Space Marine force, acting as a unified army, the way the old legions once did, is essentially impossible without a leader of unquestioned authority, giving orders that all chapters would accept. The High Lords of Terra filled the administrative vacuum left by the Emperor's incapacitation and the loss of the Primarchs. They were the leaders of the Imperium's major institutions, the Administratum, the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Adeptus Astra, Telepathica, the Adeptus Arbites, the Space Marine chapters, the Adeptus Custodes, the Inquisition, and others gathering in council to make collective decisions about the direction of humanity's civilization. Their authority, derived from the Emperor's name, claimed in his absence. Their legitimacy was always somewhat questionable, but in the absence of any alternative, it became the foundation on which everything else was built. The Adeptus Mechanicus, those strange priests of technology on Mars whose religion predated the Imperium's founding and was incorporated into it through a treaty of mutual convenience, continued to do what they had always done: maintain the machines, venerate the knowledge of the past, and guard their monopoly on technical understanding with a fanaticism that mirrored every other form of religious devotion in the setting. Their decline in capability over 10,000 years is one of the most quietly devastating arcs in the setting's history. They began as the custodians of humanity's accumulated technological knowledge. They became the custodians of the rituals that had replaced that knowledge, of the ceremonies and incantations that substituted for genuine understanding of how machines worked. Innovation became heresy. Experimentation became something to be feared. The men of iron robots that had rebelled in the dark age of technology haunted the Mechanicus's institutional memory as justification for suppressing any inquiry that might lead to artificial intelligence. The result is a civilization surrounded by the remnants of a technological era it cannot match, and, crucially, has largely stopped trying to. Weapons and vehicles and ships that would have been routine production items in the dark age of technology are now treated as sacred relics, maintained by ritual more than by engineering. The Imperium's industrial output is enormous, but it is the output of a factory culture that has learned to replicate rather than innovate, and even that replication capacity is slowly degrading as the understanding behind it erodes. The ecclesiarchy grew from a fringe sect, the Lectitio Divinitatis, the document that first argued the emperor was a god, written during the Great Crusade by people who had been close enough to him to understand that his capabilities placed him in a different category from ordinary humans into the dominant cultural force of the entire civilization. 10,000 years of institutional development have given the Adeptus Ministorum a reach that extends to virtually every human world in the Imperium, churches on every planet, missionaries on every frontier, schools that teach the catechism before they teach anything else, a schola progenium that shapes the values and beliefs of the Imperium's future officers and administrators from their youngest years, a military organization, the Adepta Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, that has demonstrated repeatedly and undeniably the ability to produce actual supernatural effects through faith in the Emperor. That last point is worth dwelling on, because it is one of the most philosophically interesting aspects of the setting. The Emperor specifically wanted to prevent the worship of himself, because he understood that warp entities feed on worship. And yet, by the 41st millennium, the faith of billions of humans directed at the Emperor is producing genuine miracles. The living saints of the ecclesiarchy are real, their powers are real. The faith itself is doing something. Whether this means the Emperor has become, in some sense, the god he always denied being, whether it means that the Chaos God's approach was right all along, and any sufficiently worshipped being in the warp acquires genuine divine capabilities, whether it means something else entirely, these are questions that the setting deliberately leaves open, because they are deeply interesting, and because answering them definitively would resolve one of the richest tensions in the lore. By the 41st millennium, the Imperium has reached a specific kind of breaking point. A civilization that has been declining for 10,000 years, that has lost more knowledge than it has generated, that has fought more wars than any accounting could capture, that has survived through sheer stubbornness and the extraordinary capability of its individual warriors, more than through any coherent strategic vision, is still standing, but only barely. Then Abaddon launched his 13th Black Crusade. Cadia fell. The pylons that had suppressed warp activity across an entire sector for millennia were destroyed. The Eye of Terror, that ancient wound in reality, expanded and spread, and the galaxy was torn in half by the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, that vast perpetual storm of warp energy that has divided the Imperium into two halves, Imperium Sanctus, which can still feel the light of the Astronomicon, and Imperium Nihilus, which cannot, where entire systems have been isolated in darkness and silence, fighting alone without reinforcement or communication, for years now and counting. Rabut Guilliman was resurrected in this context, at the absolute worst possible moment, which is to say, at exactly the moment his return was most needed. The technical genius of Belisarius' call and the psychic intervention of the Ynnari combined to restore him, the first Primarch in 10,000 years to walk the galaxy awake. His reaction to what he found, his horror at the Imperium that had been built in his and his father's name, his fury at the waste and the fanaticism and the institutional cowardice is one of the most compelling things the modern era of the setting has produced. And one of his first acts was to go to Terra, to stand in his father's presence for the first time in 10,000 years. And whatever he saw in that encounter changed something in his understanding of what the Emperor was, and what the Emperor might become, and what the future might hold. He has not told us what was said, only that it left him uncertain in ways he was not uncertain before, that his father seemed to him something vast and growing, and not entirely the man he had once known. Let us be very precise about what it means for the Golden Throne to fail, because the language around this is often vague in a way that obscures the urgency of the situation. The deterioration of the throne is not like a battery running low. It is not a linear decline that can be plotted on a graph and extrapolated to a specific date. It is a complex system degradation involving multiple interdependent components, some of which are understood by the tech priests maintaining it, and some of which are not, and the interactions between those components produce effects that are difficult to predict and impossible to fully model with the information currently available. What is known is this: the throne was designed to perform two functions simultaneously. The first was to serve as a psychic amplifier and broadcaster, sustaining the Astronomicon beacon that guides human ships through the warp. The second was to maintain the seal on the demonic incursion in the webway below the Imperial Palace, the crack that Magnus accidentally opened and that the Emperor sealed with his own psychic presence. These two functions require different kinds of output from the same device, and the resources devoted to one affect the resources available for the other. For 10,000 years, The Emperor's will and the throne's mechanisms have balanced these requirements. The fact that this balance has been maintained at all, given the state of the throne's mechanisms and the degradation of the knowledge base required to maintain them, is itself a testament to the Emperor's extraordinary will. He is not merely being sustained by the throne. He is, in some active sense, holding it together from the inside, directing its functions through the psychic connection between his consciousness and the machine, compensating for mechanical failures with sheer mental effort. But sheer mental effort has limits, even for the Emperor, and the limits are becoming visible. The Adeptus Mechanicus has been searching for a solution for millennia. The nature of that search, however, has been shaped by the same institutional constraints that limit all Mechanicus inquiry. Anything that looks too much like creative innovation, too much like departing from sanctioned knowledge, too much like the kind of experimentation that might be called tech heresy, runs into the deeply conservative internal politics of an organization that has spent 10,000 years treating the status quo as sacred. Into this context steps Belisarius Cawl, and he is one of the most fascinating characters in the modern 40,000 setting precisely because he represents a very specific kind of exception. Cawl is, by any reasonable assessment, the most intellectually capable figure in the Imperium of the 41st millennium. His processing power, distributed across hundreds of subsidiary cognitive systems he has grafted into his own architecture over centuries of self-modification, gives him a capacity for simultaneous analysis and long-term planning that approaches what the Emperor himself was once capable of. He thinks in centuries, plans in millennia, and has been working on projects that were originally assigned to him by Robert Guillemot 10,000 years ago. Among those projects is the question of the Golden Throne. Cawl has stated, in contexts that suggest he was not being diplomatically evasive, that he may have the knowledge to repair or even replace the throne. He has hinted at understanding of the underlying principles that other tech priests have lost access to. He has spent time in locations and examined artifacts that might have given him access to information that predates even the original construction of the throne. But what he knows and what he is permitted to attempt are very different things. The political and religious barriers to allowing Cawl anywhere near the Golden Throne are enormous. The throne is, in the imperial cult's understanding, the most sacred object in the universe. It is the resting place of the God Emperor himself, the point of contact between the divine and the material. The suggestion that it needs to be repaired, that it is, in some sense, broken or inadequate, is theologically uncomfortable for many in the ecclesiarchy, because it implies that the Emperor's resting place is imperfect, which implies that the Emperor is not fully protected by his own divine providence. The suggestion that it should be modified is worse. Modifying the throne means introducing new components to the Emperor's living space, potentially changing the conditions of his existence, potentially disturbing arrangements that have been in place for 10 millennia. The Adeptus Custodes, who guard the throne with the absolute dedication that has defined their entire purpose for 10,000 years, would need to consent to such work, and they are not an institution that consents to things easily. They are also, in the current era, more active than they have been in living memory, with shield captains leading forces into battlefields across the galaxy in ways that suggest a shift in their understanding of what protecting the Emperor requires. There is also the question of what, exactly, would be needed. If the throne needs replacing, what replaces it? If it needs the Emperor's own guidance to be successfully repaired, how do you communicate with a being who has not communicated with anyone in 10,000 years? If the webway seal needs to be maintained during any repair work, who maintains it while the throne is being modified? These are not rhetorical obstacles. They are genuine engineering challenges of extraordinary complexity, and the fact that no one has attempted to solve them is not simply institutional cowardice or theological squeamishness. It is, at least in part, because the risk of getting any part of it wrong is the risk of killing the Emperor immediately rather than slowly. And no one wants to be the person who made that call. The Custodes, for all their silence about their reasons, seem to understand the situation clearly. Their deployment away from Terra in recent years, something unprecedented in the history of the Imperium, speaks to a decision made somewhere in their leadership, possibly in response to something the Emperor has communicated to them through means unavailable to everyone else, that the external situation has become serious enough to justify leaving the throne less heavily guarded. Or, alternatively, that the emperor's instructions have changed. That whatever he has been thinking about for 10,000 years has produced a new direction. That the vigil is, in some sense, the custodies understand but cannot yet share, entering a new phase. The clock is ticking, the machine is failing. The question of what comes next is no longer a purely theoretical exercise for lore enthusiasts to debate in comfortable abstraction. In the framing of the setting itself, it is the most urgent question in the universe. There is no single theory, canonically confirmed, of how the Emperor might return. What the setting offers instead is a collection of possibilities, some explicit in the lore, some implied, some drawn from the logical implications of established facts, and each of them is worth examining carefully, because each one produces a different emperor who means a different thing to the Imperium and the galaxy. The Star Child and the Sensei, the oldest theory. The Star Child theory dates back to the earliest editions of Warhammer 40,000, long before the Horus Heresy novel series and the modern era's expansion of the lore. It emerged from the realm of Chaos sourcebooks and the Inquisition war novels, and it represents a particular kind of approach to the Emperor's situation, one that is simultaneously the most hopeful and the most metaphysically strange. The theory begins with the specific nature of the damage done to the Emperor during the battle with Horus. The wounds were not simply physical. They were, in every account, wounds of the soul, as well as the body attacks, directed at his psychic presence in the warp, his consciousness as it extends into the immaterium, the spiritual dimension of his being. The result was that much of the Emperor's psychic self was scattered, dispersed into the warp, where it drifted and mingled with the currents of the immaterium in ways that are not easily recoverable. The Star Child theory proposes that not all of this scattered essence dissolved, that a portion of it specifically, the aspects of the Emperor's character that he had most ruthlessly suppressed during his millennia of strategic preparation, survived as a separate entity in the warp, slowly gathering strength and coherence. The Chaos Gods, in this framing, had been influencing the Emperor long before the heresy, not with the crude corrupting touch they used on Horus, but with something subtler, a steering influence, applied over centuries, that nudged the Emperor toward an ever more cold and calculating mode of existence. The four ruinous powers understood something crucial: an Emperor who operated on pure strategic logic, who had stripped away his emotional responses and his capacity for personal attachment in the name of efficient planning, was less dangerous to them than one who acted from love and grief and human connection. Those latter qualities are exactly what empowers individuals against chaos. Personal loyalty, genuine care, the willingness to sacrifice the abstract, strategic advantage for the concrete human reality. These are the things that produce saints and heroes, the things that make ordinary humans capable of the extraordinary acts that resist corruption. So the Chaos Gods, according to this theory, encouraged the Emperor's coldness. They amplified his tendency to see people as instruments and tools. They made it easier for him to make decisions about his sons and his servants that treated them as pieces in a game rather than as individuals with their own inner lives that deserved to be acknowledged. And the qualities they were suppressing, the compassion, the love, the grief, the capacity to be truly wounded by the failures of his relationships, those qualities, cast off by a being who had convinced himself they were liabilities, drifted into the warp and began, slowly, to become something. This is the Star Child, also called the Numen, a fragment of the Emperor's soul that carries what he discarded. A psychic entity gestating in the immaterium, fed by the faith of billions who pray to the God Emperor with genuine love and devotion, growing in strength and coherence across 10,000 years of the Golden Throne's slow vigil. The Illuminati were a secret society within the Inquisition who developed this theory and believed it sufficiently to act on it. They had identified the Sensei, the immortal, warp-invisible descendants of the Emperor himself, born across his millennia of mortal life, each one a blank in the psychic sense, invisible to the warp, unable to be sensed by demons or psychers, or even the Emperor himself. The Sensei live strange, isolated lives, perpetually young and ageless, but perpetually hunted by the institutions of the Imperium, who find their nature suspicious and their origins impossible to properly classify. The Illuminati believed that gathering the sensei and, at the moment of the emperor's physical death, sacrificing them, creating an enormous, concentrated burst of psychic energy from beings uniquely positioned to channel it without chaos contamination, could birth the Star Child into full existence. Not a continuation of the Emperor as he had been, something new. A being born of what he had suppressed, carrying the love and the compassion and the grief that the original had set aside, capable of engaging with the warp and with humanity on terms that the cold, calculating strategic Emperor never could. The Illuminati and the Sensei have been largely absent from modern lore. Whether they still exist, whether their plan is still active, whether the concept has been quietly retired by the current creative teams, or is being preserved for a future payoff, all of this is unclear. But the underlying concept remains alive, that the Emperor's death might be a transformation rather than a termination. The perpetual who cannot die, the mechanistic theory. The Horus Heresy novels established, over the course of a series that ran for more than 50 volumes, that the Emperor is almost certainly a perpetual. We discussed what perpetuals are earlier, but here we need to examine the implications of that nature for the question of his potential return. The crucial observation is this: perpetuals do not die in the way ordinary beings die. Their biology, or whatever the psychic mechanism is that underlies their regeneration, does not recognize death as a permanent state. Given sufficient time and the right conditions, they come back. Vulcan, the primarch of the salamanders, who was himself a perpetual, survived forms of death that would have been permanently final for any other being in the setting, including being repeatedly killed by the Night Lord's traitor Conrad Kurz across a period of extended captivity. He reformed, he returned. If the Emperor is a perpetual, then the Golden Throne may be doing something more complex than simply sustaining his broken body. It may be preventing his natural regeneration from occurring. Think about the specific conditions required for perpetual regeneration. The body and soul need, in some sense, to be allowed to die fully before they can reconstitute. A, being held in a state of perpetual suspension, too damaged to function, but continuously sustained just enough to prevent the process of complete dissolution that would trigger the regeneration mechanism, might be trapped in exactly the worst possible position, too alive to heal, too dead to function, held in the middle by a machine designed to serve the Imperium's needs rather than the Emperor's well-being. If this is correct, then removing the Emperor from the throne, if the Astronomicon and Webway seal could be handled in some other way during the transition, might trigger a regenerative process. Painful, extended, perhaps requiring decades, but real recovery. A return to physical wholeness and functional consciousness. The problem, again, is the transition. The Astronomicon cannot simply go dark for a generation while the Emperor recovers. The Webway seal cannot be maintained by any other known means while he is detached from the throne. Any gap in those functions would produce catastrophic consequences for the Imperium, consequences that might be impossible to recover from even if the Emperor eventually emerged from his regeneration at full strength. There is also the question, raised by careful reading of the lore, of why the Emperor himself has not attempted this if he knew about his perpetual nature. He must have known he was aware of other perpetuals, worked with them, understood their capabilities. Why, in 10,000 years of consciousness on the throne, has he not found a way to communicate instructions for his own removal and regeneration? The most troubling answer is that he tried and was prevented. The Custodes are instructed to resist anyone who tries to reanimate him. This is explicitly stated in the lore. But the second most troubling answer is that he knows something about his own condition, or about the consequences of his removal, that makes the current situation preferable to the alternatives. And that something might not be comfortable information. The God. Ascending the transcendence theory. The third major theory is the one most directly supported by the current lore trajectory, and it is the one that has the most profound implications for the setting going forward. It rests on an observation that several characters within the novels have made, that Guillemin's encounter with his father seemed to confirm, and that the general direction of the modern storyline appears to be building toward. The Emperor is not simply maintaining, he is growing. Slowly, across 10,000 years, fed by the faith of trillions and the souls of millions, and his own extraordinary will directed toward a purpose he has not abandoned. Even in the midst of agony, he is becoming something that did not previously exist. We established earlier that the chaos gods grow from the accumulated psychic weight of conscious minds across vast spans of time. They are not born so much as condense the emotional energies of billions of beings over eons, becoming coherent and intentional in the form of an entity that expresses and amplifies those emotions. Korn from violence, Nurgle from despair, Tzeentch from the desire for change, Slaanesh from excess. The Emperor, in his current state, is being fed by worship and sacrifice in a structural sense that parallels the Chaos God's own growth processes. Billions of humans pray to him daily with genuine faith. Thousands are sacrificed in his name. His servants invoke his name before battle and claim his protection in their most desperate moments, and increasingly especially since the Great Rift opened and flooded the galaxy with warp energy, that invocation produces real effects. Living saints walk the battlefields of the 41st millennium. Miracles are documented. Faith manifests as something physically observable and impossible to explain by conventional means. What is all of that faith doing? Where is it going? It is going into the warp, directed at the presence there that carries the Emperor's name and personality. It is feeding something that has been in the warp for 10,000 years, that started as the shattered remnant of a dying man's psychic projection and has been accumulating strength ever since. The war of faith that began after the Great Rift, the age of witches that some call the psychic awakening, the increasing frequency and intensity of miraculous events. These might not be chaos. They might be the early manifestations of a fifth power entering the warp. Not a chaos god, because the Emperor's essence is antithetical to chaos in a way that makes the comparison misleading. Something else. A god of order, perhaps, or of rational will, or of the specific quality the setting calls imperial, that stubborn, often brutal, frequently wrong, but never entirely dishonest commitment to the idea that humanity deserves to survive. If the ascension theory is correct, the Emperor's return would not be a man rising from a chair. It would be the birth of something that the warp has never seen before, manifesting in real space through the physical vessel that is still, just barely, keeping its connection to the material universe alive. Something that walks in human form because it began as human, that speaks with a human voice because that is what it knows how to be, but that perceives the universe on a scale and with a completeness that no being called human has ever previously achieved. Let us imagine the moment, not abstractly, but with the specific sensory and emotional texture that the setting deserves when it is treated with care. The Golden Throne goes quiet, not in the way it has sometimes flickered, not in the brief, terrifying silences that send tech priests into frenzies of prayer and recitation, not in the alarm-triggering fluctuations that have happened perhaps a dozen times in the past 1,000 years. A different quiet, the subsonic hum that has been present in the throne room for 10,000 years, so constant that it has ceased to register as a sound and has become instead part of the texture of the air, of the experience of existing in that space, stops, all at once, completely. In the moment that follows, nothing moves. The tech priests positioned around the throne, those red-robed figures whose entire lives are devoted to the maintenance of the most important machine in the universe, freeze in the middle of their rituals, their chanting cutting off mid-syllable, their instruments providing readings that make no sense in any framework they have been given to interpret data. The custodians along the walls of the chamber, those golden-armored warriors who have stood this watch for their entire existences, who have been chosen and trained and shaped for this single purpose, feel it in the psychic dimension before they perceive it physically. A change in the presence they have been guarding. A shift so fundamental it does not register as an alarm, but as something closer to the quality of the moment before a storm breaks. Then light. Not the ambient golden glow of the palace's illumination systems, not the flickering of candles or the steady burn of lumen globes. Something that comes from the throne itself, from the figure in it, from something that has been building for 10,000 years and has, in this moment, decided that the waiting is over. A light that does not illuminate the room so much as it transforms it, that makes the stone walls and the golden architecture and the ancient cables and the red-robed priests all seem, for a moment, like details in a much larger picture that has just become visible. The custodians would be on their knees before they understood why. not in the abject terror of those who fear something, in the reflexive posture of those who are in the presence of something so far beyond ordinary experience that the body's response bypasses the mind entirely. The custodies are not easily moved. They are possibly the most psychologically resilient warriors the Imperium has ever produced, shaped by the most intensive training and genetic modification the Emperor himself devised, and they are on their knees. The first communication would not be in words. A being that has been conducting its entire existence in the psychic dimension, that has spent 10,000 years fighting battles in the immaterium, while its body sat motionless in a chair, would not immediately reach for verbal language. It would reach for direct communication, a psychic transmission that carries meaning more efficiently and more completely than any articulated sentence. A message that arrives not as sound in the ears, but as understanding in the mind, sudden and complete, without the ambiguity that words inevitably carry. Every psyker on Terra would feel it simultaneously. Astropaths in their towers, maintaining their endless vigil of psychic communication. Librarians in their halls of training. Inquisitors with their hidden talents. Every human being on the most sacred world in the Imperium, with any capacity to perceive the psychic dimension, would experience something like being struck very gently, very precisely, by a wave of pure meaning. Not painful, not alarming, more like being reminded of something you had forgotten you knew. The Astronomicon would change. Every navigator in every ship in the galaxy would feel it, simultaneously, wherever they were, whatever they were doing. That psychic lighthouse they rely on to chart their course through the warp, that fixed star in the immaterial void by which all Imperial navigation is oriented, would blaze with an intensity and a clarity it has not possessed. In living memory, not in the historical records of living navigators, not in the accounts of the previous generation, or the generation before that, in something closer to what the records of the Great Crusade describe, written by navigators who sailed under the full light of an emperor still at his height. Ships in difficult warp transits would find their way suddenly and inexplicably clearer. Fleet commanders in the middle of desperate journeys through unstable regions would receive reports from their navigators that made no immediate strategic sense, that the storm had calmed, that the route was clear, that the transit that was estimated to take 6 weeks had, somehow, become achievable in 2. They would not immediately understand why. The news from Terra would reach them later, moving at the speed of astropathic communication, arriving after the fact to explain what their navigators had already experienced in real time. In the warp itself, the shockwave would be felt by every entity that exists there. The Chaos Gods, those vast, ancient, incomprehensible beings of pure emotion and psychic energy, would perceive it as what it is, a change in the balance of power in their domain. The specific qualities of that change would depend on the form the Emperor's return takes. A mere physical restoration, a man getting up from a chair, would produce a shift, certainly, but a manageable one. An ascension to something divine, a fifth power entering the warp, a new entity of comparable scale to the Chaos Gods themselves, would hit the immaterium like a physical blow. Demonic entities pressed against the veil between the warp and real space on 100 worlds simultaneously would find themselves suddenly hammered back. The barrier they had been pushing against, which had been thinning and weakening under the sustained pressure of the current era's warp storms, would strengthen in a way they had not encountered before. Not simply the ordinary resistance of the material universe, pushing back against the psychic intrusion, something active, something intentional, something that, for the first time in 10,000 years, was pushing back rather than merely holding. The reaction on demonic incursion fronts around the galaxy would take hours to manifest in the physical world. Commanders who had been fighting desperate rearguard actions against overwhelming demonic pressure would find their enemies suddenly less aggressive, less coordinated, less certain. Officers who had spent years reading demonic tactical behavior would notice the change immediately and understand it as significant without being able to explain what had changed. They're pulling back. Someone would report from a position that had been about to collapse. Not to regroup, they're just pulling back. And, from 100 similar positions across the galaxy, similar reports would begin to filter in. The forces of the Traitor Legions, the Chaos Space Marines, and their mortal followers, the warbands of the Black Legion and the Iron Warriors, and all the rest, would receive a different kind of signal. The demonically possessed and the psychically marked would feel it first. As a wrongness, a disruption in the certainty that had defined their understanding of the galaxy's direction. For 10,000 years, the trajectory had been clear. The Imperium was declining, the Golden Throne was failing, the Emperor was dying, and the end of the age of the false Emperor was coming. Now, something in that certainty had cracked. The most psychically sensitive of Chaos's servants, the sorcerers of the Thousand Suns, the daemon princes who had traded their humanity for the power of the Chaos gods, the diviners who read the currents of the warp for signs of future events, would know immediately what had happened. And the information would spread through the forces of chaos, not as news, but as a cold, specific, deeply personal dread. The thing they had been waiting to see happen, the final failure of the throne, the consumption of the Emperor's soul by the ruinous powers, was not happening. Something else was happening instead. Abaddon the Despoiler, wherever he was in that moment, would understand before anyone else what it meant. He has spent more than 10,000 years preparing for the end of the Emperor's age. Every Black Crusade, every act of civilizational destruction he has committed, every world he has burned or corrupted or twisted, it has all been in service of a plan that required the Emperor to die in a specific way at a specific moment when the forces of chaos were positioned to capitalize on it. If the Emperor's return was not the death the Despoiler had planned for, if the trajectory had changed in a way that was not part of his calculations, then 10,000 years of preparation had just been rendered obsolete, and Abaddon would need to improvise, which would make him more dangerous, not less. The political crisis that an emperor's return would trigger within the Imperium is not a secondary concern or a minor complication. It is, potentially, the most dangerous immediate consequence of his restoration, more immediately threatening than any external enemy, because external enemies can be fought with weapons and strategies the Imperium understands, while an internal crisis of legitimacy and theological identity is something entirely outside its institutional capacity to handle. The Adeptus Ministorum has spent 10,000 years building an institution on a foundation that an active emperor would immediately challenge. Not with political authority, the ecclesiarchy would presumably have to defer to the emperor himself if he actually returned, since their entire claim to authority derives from representing his divine will, but with his very existence. The emperor has been, throughout the entire history of the imperial cult, a being who cannot speak for himself. This is not incidental to the ecclesiarchy's power. It is foundational to it. A god who cannot contradict his clergy is, from the clergy's perspective, the perfect arrangement. The high confessors, and the cardinals, and the archconfessors can claim to interpret the emperor's will, can present their own institutional interests as divinely ordained, can declare any theological position they choose as heretical, because the emperor himself is not available to say otherwise. His silence is their authority. If he speaks, that authority evaporates. Worse than evaporates, it becomes a liability. Because every theological claim the ecclesiarchy has ever made in the emperor's name, every declaration of heresy, every doctrine of faith, every institutional arrangement justified by appeal to divine will, would now be subject to the emperor's own assessment. And given that the emperor specifically forbade the worship of himself, given that the imperial truth he promulgated was explicitly anti-religious, the assessment is not likely to be entirely favorable. The most extreme elements of the ecclesiarchy, the kind of institutional fanaticism that has accumulated over 10 millennia of unchallenged religious authority, might respond to the emperor's return by declaring him a fraud. Not because they would truly believe he was a fraud, but because the alternative accepting that the emperor is real and that he rejects everything they have built in his name is existentially intolerable. It is easier, psychologically and institutionally, to declare the returned figure a demonic impostor than to dismantle 10,000 years of doctrine overnight. The Inquisition would be deeply, perhaps catastrophically, divided on this question. The Ordo Malleus, which deals specifically with demonic threats, maintains extensive records of demonic entities that have impersonated divine figures. It is one of the oldest and most documented categories of chaos deception. An entity appearing to be the emperor, claiming his authority, could in theory be the most sophisticated demonic infiltration in the history of the Imperium. The Ordo Malleus would have both the professional obligation and the institutional mandate to investigate that possibility seriously, regardless of how overwhelming the apparent evidence of authenticity might be. The Thorians, a philosophical faction within the Inquisition that has long believed in the possibility of the Emperor's divine spirit manifesting through chosen vessels, would presumably be the loudest advocates for accepting the returned Emperor as genuine. They have spent generations developing a theological framework for exactly this kind of event. Their moment, if this is what they have been waiting for, would have arrived. But their enthusiasm would be viewed with suspicion by exactly the factions most likely to need convincing, because the Thorians are regarded by much of the Inquisition as dangerous idealists who have allowed faith to override critical judgment. The political maneuvering among the High Lords of Terra, those great institutional figures who have been governing the Imperium in the Emperor's name, would be extraordinary. Some would see in the Emperor's return the end of their personal power, and would immediately begin working to manage the situation in ways that minimize the disruption to existing arrangements. Others would see an opportunity, a chance to appeal to the Emperor's authority to defeat rivals or advance agendas that had been blocked by the existing political balance. The High Lords have not been a unified body with a single purpose for most of their history. They are a collection of competing institutional interests, held in an uneasy coalition by necessity. The Emperor's return would instantly change the dynamics of that coalition in ways that no individual actor could fully predict or control. Robert Guillemot's position would be paradoxical. He has spent decades since his resurrection working to reform the Imperium, to redirect it towards something more functional and less self-destructive, armed with the authority of being the Lord Commander and a Primarch, but lacking the ultimate authority that would allow him to simply override the institutional resistance he constantly encounters. An active Emperor would, in theory, give him that ultimate authority, a direct mandate from the Emperor himself to continue his reforms, or a direct instruction to change course. Either would be clarifying in ways that Guilliman's current position is not. But the Emperor that Guilliman met in the throne room was not, by Guilliman's own account, simply the man he remembered. The uncertainty in Guilliman's reaction, a being of his strategic genius, expressing genuine not knowing about what his father had become, suggests that the Emperor's return, if and when it happens, would not produce a simple restoration of old relationships. It would produce something new, something that would need to be understood rather than assumed, and the process of that understanding would be deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved. The Adeptus Custodes, paradoxically, would perhaps be the most settled institution in the immediate aftermath. They have been waiting. They have been present. Whatever they know about the Emperor's trajectory, whatever they have perceived from 10,000 years of proximity to the throne, positions them to be less surprised by the form his return takes than any other institution. Their deployment outside Terra in recent years suggests they are already operating according to new instructions. They would be, in the chaos of the immediate aftermath, the most reliable witnesses to the authenticity of the returned Emperor, and the most effective force for establishing order in the throne room and the palace during those first critical hours. We should begin this section with honesty. The power scaling in Warhammer 40,000 at the very highest level is deliberately ambiguous, and that ambiguity is one of the things that keeps the stakes meaningful and the narrative from resolving too cleanly. The Chaos Gods are beings of essentially unlimited power within the warp. The Emperor, even ascended, would be engaging with them on their home ground. Any claim to certainty about the outcome of such an engagement would be overstating what the lore actually establishes. But we can reason carefully from what is known, and that reasoning is rich and interesting and deserves to be done properly. The Chaos Gods are, individually, beings of essentially unbounded power within their own domains. In the warp, in regions of real space saturated with their specific emotional energies, they can reshape existence according to their will. Khorne's domain is a brass citadel soaked in blood, a place where violence is the foundational principle of reality, where the rules of physics are simply the rules of battle applied universally. Nurgle's garden is a place of pestilence and strange comfort, where entropy is embraced rather than resisted, and the boundary between life and death becomes fluid and irrelevant. Tsiench's domain is a place of constant change, where nothing remains the same between one moment and the next, where fate and chance are the same thing observed from different angles. Slaaneish's realm is sensation beyond the capacity of language to describe, experience amplified past any sustainable threshold into something that is simultaneously ecstatic and annihilating. In real space, the Chaos Gods are more constrained. They manifest through intermediaries, daemons, corrupted mortals, psychically tainted environments. Their direct presence in the material universe is limited in ways that the Emperor, as a being who truly exists in both dimensions simultaneously, is not constrained by. This is, in a fundamental sense, the Emperor's strategic advantage. He can engage on the physical plane in ways the Chaos Gods cannot, while also engaging in the warp in ways that ordinary physical beings cannot. The question of whether he could destroy the Chaos Gods is one that the lore answers fairly directly, and the answer is no, not in any permanent sense, and probably not in any meaningful temporary sense either. The Chaos Gods cannot be killed by conventional means, because they are not entities in the conventional sense. They are concentrations of psychic energy, shaped by the emotional outputs of conscious beings, existing as long as those beings exist and those emotions persist. Khorne endures as long as beings capable of violence exist. Nurgle endures as long as beings capable of despair and decay exist. Tzeentch endures as long as beings capable of desire for change exist. Slaanesh endures as long as beings capable of excess exist. To kill Khorne, you would need to eliminate violence from the universe. To kill Nurgle, you would need to eliminate decay and despair. These are not things that even an entity of the Emperor's magnitude could accomplish, because they would require changing the fundamental emotional and biological nature of every conscious being in the galaxy. The Emperor could not unmake suffering or ambition or hunger or desire, and as long as those things exist, their warp expressions will exist too. What a returned or ascended Emperor could potentially do is contain them. Establish a psychic bulwark of sufficient power and precision to prevent the Chaos Gods from expressing their will in real space at the scale and frequency they currently do. The Great Rift, that catastrophic wound across the galaxy, might be within the scope of an ascended Emperor's power to seal, or at minimum, to dramatically reduce. The constant pressure of daemonic incursions on thousands of worlds simultaneously, the steady erosion of humanity's defensive capability against chaos, the creeping corruption that finds its way into every institution and relationship and individual soul that is not vigilantly protected, all of these could potentially be reduced to a level that the Imperium could actually manage, rather than being slowly overwhelmed by. Think about what the galaxy looked like at the height of the Great Crusade, when the Emperor was at full strength and actively engaged. Warp storms that had persisted for decades cleared in the advance of the Legion fleets. Daemon incursions that had been entrenched for generations were driven back. Worlds that had been lost to chaos for centuries were reclaimed. Not permanently, the Chaos Gods always found their way back eventually, but meaningfully. The retreats imposed real costs on chaos and real gains for humanity. An emperor at the height of what he was then, or at something greater than that, could potentially recreate those conditions, not as a temporary effect of his presence on a specific battlefield, but as a sustained state. A galaxy where chaos is still real, still dangerous, still impossible to permanently defeat, but where it is held at sufficient bay that other existential threats, the Tyrannid hive fleets consuming the galaxy from without, the Necron dynasties, pursuing their ancient agendas with awakening force, can be addressed without the constant background erosion of daemonic pressure, making every other conflict harder than it needs to be. The specific dynamics of a direct confrontation between the Emperor and the Chaos Gods in the Warp would be unlike anything described in the setting's existing literature. The Emperor's experience on the Golden Throne has been, in part, exactly this, fighting the Chaos Gods and their agents in the Immaterium, while his body sat immobile on Terra. But fighting defensively, from a position of limited resources and declining capability, is a very different thing from fighting offensively from a position of restored or transcendent strength. The Chaos Gods would not meet such a challenge passively. Each of them has been anticipating this possibility in their own characteristic ways for 10,000 years. Tzeentch, whose nature is to plan and anticipate and redirect, has almost certainly constructed scenarios intended to turn an emperor's ascension to his own advantage, whether by corrupting the ascension itself, By using the Emperor's increased power as a lever to achieve outcomes beneficial to chaos, or by arranging for the Ascension to take a form that is less threatening to chaos than the Emperor intends. Tzeentch manipulates. That is not merely what he does, it is what he is. Khorne, by contrast, would welcome the confrontation. An entity of battle matching itself against the greatest opposing force in the galaxy is exactly what Khorne desires. Whether the Emperor won or lost such a confrontation, if it involved sufficient violence and bloodshed on sufficient scale, Khorne would in some sense gain from it, which is its own kind of trap, and one the Emperor would need to account for in deciding how to engage. Nurgle's response would be the most subtle and perhaps the most dangerous. The essence of Nurgle's philosophy, the acceptance of entropy, the embrace of decay, the understanding that everything changes, and that change is not loss, but transformation, has a certain terrible wisdom to it that the other Chaos Gods lack. Nurgle might not resist the Emperor's return at all. He might, instead, simply wait, confident in the understanding that even an ascended Emperor exists in time, and time is Nurgle's domain. Here we arrive at the question that sits at the center of everything, and it is one with no clean resolution, because the setting has not provided one and may never do so completely. That deliberate irresolution is one of its great strengths. Let us consider the best case with full honesty about what it would and would not achieve. An Emperor returned, whether physically restored to something like his former capability, or ascended to a form of divine existence that the setting has been building toward for a decade of narrative development, resolves the immediate crisis of the failing Golden Throne. The Astronomicon burns on, stronger than before. The daemonic pressure on the Imperium's frontiers eases. The Great Rift, which has been the setting's defining catastrophe since the end of the 41st millennium's final days, is sealed or reduced. Guilliman has his father's guidance at last. The Lord Commander finally able to operate with a clear mandate rather than the politically ambiguous authority he currently holds. The long-term consequences are far more complicated. The Imperium that would receive the Emperor's return is not the Imperium he built. It is something that developed in his absence, shaped by 10,000 years of institutional drift and theological distortion and military necessity and political compromise. The Emperor's assessment of what has been built in his name would not, if his original principles are any guide, be entirely favorable. The imperial truth rationalism, secularism, the deliberate suppression of religious faith in the Emperor himself is not compatible with the society that currently exists. You cannot tell 10 trillion people who have prayed to their God every day of their lives that their God is not actually a God and have them nod and adjust their prayers. The psychological and social trauma of such a revelation, even if the Emperor handled it with extraordinary care and patience, would be immense. Some worlds would descend into crisis, not from demonic invasion, but from the collapse of the belief system that had given their existence meaning. And there is a deeper problem. The Emperor's prohibition against worshipping him was not simply an aesthetic preference or a philosophical position. It was a strategic calculation about how worship empowers entities in the warp. But the extraordinary fact of the current era is that the faith directed at the Emperor appears to be empowering him, specifically, in ways that have been beneficial rather than harmful. If the Chaos Gods feed on worship and become dangerous, and the Emperor has also been fed by worship and has become potentially the force that can oppose the Chaos Gods, what does that imply about the original strategic calculation? It implies that the Emperor may have been wrong, or that his original assessment was correct for the conditions that existed when he formulated it, but those conditions changed in ways he could not have predicted, and the correct strategy changed with them. An ascended Emperor who has spent 10,000 years thinking, who has been unable to move or speak, but has certainly been able to think and think and think, may have already worked through this. He may return with a revised understanding of his own nature and a revised strategic doctrine that accounts for what the Imperium has actually become, rather than insisting on the Imperium as originally designed. This would require a kind of humility that the Emperor of the Great Crusade did not always demonstrate, the ability to say, essentially, that he had been wrong about something, and that the corrective institution built by the people who worshipped him in his absence has, in certain key respects, achieved through the wrong means, something that approximates the right outcome. The ecclesiarchy was not supposed to exist. But the Adepta Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, who channel genuine supernatural power through faith in him, are demonstrably effective against the very threats he was most concerned about. The imperial cult was not supposed to exist, but the faith it sustains in billions of ordinary humans gives those humans a psychic resilience against chaos corruption that the original imperial truth, for all its intellectual elegance, did not provide. A returned emperor who could acknowledge this complexity, who could work with the institution that grew in his absence, rather than simply dismantling it, who could redirect its fanaticism toward purposes it is actually good for, while correcting its worst excesses. That would be a being more interesting and more authentically imperial than the cold strategic genius of the Great Crusade ever was. But we should not assume this is what he has become. 10,000 years of agony, while feeding on the souls of the dead and fighting an unending battle in the immaterium against entities of pure malice, might produce a being who is more patient and wise. It might also produce a being who is something else, something shaped by the specific conditions of his imprisonment, in ways that no one outside that imprisonment can fully anticipate. Guilliman's account is the most direct evidence we have, and what it suggests is unsettling in a way that is not easily resolved. Not frightening. Guilliman would be frightened if he perceived what he had encountered as a threat. He perceived it as vast, as strange, as entirely beyond his existing framework for understanding his father. That is not the description of something evil, but it is also not the description of something familiar. There is a scenario that represents perhaps the most authentically grimdark possibility among all the ones available. That the Emperor returns and saves the Imperium, and the Imperium endures, but what it endures as is something even more tightly controlled, even more completely directed by a single will than anything the current era of the setting has produced. That 10,000 years of psychic ascension, and the specific experience of existing simultaneously in the warp and real space for that entire period, has not produced a god of love and compassion and patient wisdom. That it has produced something brilliant and powerful and irreversibly opposed to chaos, but not particularly interested in human freedom or human joy or any of the things that make existence worth living for the individuals caught inside the system. The most ancient fear about the Emperor, a fear expressed by Chaos's servants, who know they are liars but tell certain truths anyway, is that he is himself a tyrant. That the Imperium he built was never intended to be a truly good place for ordinary people to live, but a managed population of tool users, shaped and directed and sacrificed as needed by a being who cares about the survival of the species in the abstract, but has never been fully capable of caring about the suffering of any particular individual within it. That the God Emperor the ecclesiarchy worships is, in its way, as manipulative and as consuming as the Chaos Gods, it opposes just better at hiding the fact because it presents itself as protective rather than hungry. This is the reading that makes Warhammer 40,000 profoundly dark rather than simply violent. Not that the enemy is terrible, the enemy is obviously terrible, but that the defender might be, in ways that are harder to see and harder to confront, also something complicated and perhaps not entirely admirable. That the choice humanity faces is not between a good option and a bad option, but between different forms of something that could be called, from the right angle, captivity. A returned emperor who embodies that complexity, who is completely, irreversibly opposed to chaos, who is fully committed to human survival as a cause, but who pursues that cause in ways that an individual human might not choose, if the choice were really theirs, would be the most honest and most interesting version of the Emperor's return. It would not be the triumphant salvation the loyal imperial subjects dream of. It would be something more ambiguous, something that raises as many questions as it answers, something that the setting's characters, and by extension its readers, would need to grapple with rather than simply celebrate. And there is still the other possibility, the one that haunts the edges of every discussion about the Emperor's fate, that he does not return, that the Golden Throne fails, and whatever he has been becoming dissolves rather than solidifies, and the Chaos Gods claim their prize at last. That the Astronomicon goes dark across the galaxy, one light going out in the great void, and the Imperium, which has been dying by degrees for 10,000 years, anyway finally admits to the death it has been delaying. This outcome would not be the end of the setting. It might be the beginning of its most interesting period, a galaxy without the Emperor's influence, where humanity must somehow continue without the psychic anchor that has defined its civilization for 10 millennia, where other factions and forces fill the space left by the Imperium's collapse or partial collapse, where the outcome is truly unknown, rather than stabilized by the presence of an overwhelming power. The Warhammer 40,000 universe has always been about the question of whether survival is worth the cost of the methods required to achieve it, whether the price the Imperium pays in freedom, in justice, in the ordinary human texture of a life worth living is justified by the outcome it is purchasing, whether any outcome, however good in the abstract, can be worth 10,000 years of the specific suffering the setting has documented across decades of stories. The Emperor's return does not answer that question. In the best case, it defers it. In the worst case, it answers it in ways that are deeply uncomfortable. In the most interesting case, it transforms. It moves the question from the scale of the individual soul to the scale of the galaxy, from the question of whether any particular person's suffering was justified to the question of whether the survival of a species justifies what that species has done and been willing to do and will continue to do and be willing to do in the future, indefinitely, without a foreseeable end. There are no clean answers in the grim darkness of the far future. There are only choices, made under impossible conditions, by beings who are doing the best they can with the understanding they have, imperfect and compromised and frequently wrong, but never, for as long as any of them still breathes, quite willing to stop. And somewhere beneath the golden machine, in the silence of 10,000 years of unbroken will, something is still fighting. It has not stopped, not once. And in a universe that is very good at making things stop, that means something. That might mean everything. The question is only whether what comes next is worth what it costs to get there, and that is not a question anyone can answer for you. If this kind of careful, deep exploration of 40,000 lore is why you are here, then you already know what the next step is. Hit subscribe and come with us for the rest of the journey. This universe has more depth than any single video can capture, and we are going to spend a long time doing it justice. And drop a comment. Tell me where in the world you are watching from. Tell me what time it is there. And most importantly, tell me what you think. Does the Emperor return? And if he does, what does he return as? Does he return as the man who built the Imperium, or as something that the Imperium's 10,000 years of worship and sacrifice have made? Is that a story of hope, or something more complicated? I want to know what you think. That conversation is the reason we do this. The Emperor protects. Until next time, let us return to the Chaos Gods with the thoroughness they deserve. Because this is one of the most discussed aspects of the Emperor's potential return, and the lore has given us enough material about each of the 4 ruinous powers to make careful predictions about how they would respond to a restored or ascended Emperor. Understanding their individual natures is essential to understanding the specific shape that conflict would take. Khorne is the oldest among the 4, or at least the one whose origins stretch furthest back into the deep history of the setting. He is the blood god, the Lord of Skulls, the deity of martial fury and violence, and the specific pride that comes from conquest through superior force. His domain is brutal and magnificent in its clarity. He cares nothing for politics, nothing for subtlety, nothing for the long game of corruption and infiltration that the other Chaos Gods practice. He wants battle, he wants death. He wants skulls and the blood that spills from them, and he wants them in quantities so vast that the numbers themselves become meaningless. Khorne hates psychers. This is perhaps the most significant fact about him in the context of a discussion about the Emperor, because the Emperor is the greatest psyker in human history. Khorne's disdain for sorcery and psychic power is not merely a personality quirk. It reflects a genuine philosophical position about the nature of strength. True power, in Khorne's understanding, comes from the body and the will and the blade and the fist. It does not come from manipulating invisible forces that ordinary mortals cannot see or touch. To use psychic power is to cheat. It is to substitute cleverness for genuine strength, and Khorne finds that contemptible. An ascended emperor would represent, to Khorne, the most significant psychic entity in the galaxy, other than the Chaos Gods themselves. A being whose power is essentially entirely psychic in nature, who has not swung a blade or struck a blow in 10,000 years, who exists now primarily as a consciousness operating through the warp rather than as a physical warrior. In purely Khornate terms, this is exactly the kind of opponent that deserves the most aggressive possible response, a being of immense power that has achieved that power through the means Khorne most despises, and whose destruction would simultaneously provide an enormous quantity of skulls and the satisfaction of defeating an enemy worthy of the effort. Whether Khorne could actually defeat an ascended emperor is a different question. In the physical universe, Khorne's champion Archaon, or Abaddon himself, or a daemon prince of sufficient power, might be instruments of such an attack. In the warp, the engagement would be between fundamentally different kinds of entity. Khorne's rage and martial fury against whatever the Emperor has become after 10,000 years of building something in the immaterium. The outcome of such an engagement is beyond prediction with any confidence, but the nature of it brutal, direct, without subtlety, is entirely characteristic of Khorne. Nurgle's relationship with the Emperor is more philosophically rich and, in its way, more disturbing. The Plague Father does not simply cause disease and death. He is, in the lore's most generous and most interesting portrayal, a being who has truly found comfort in decay, who has, after uncountable eons of existence, arrived at an understanding that entropy is not the enemy of existence, but its context, that to resist change and decay is to fight the fundamental nature of the universe, and that the acceptance of that nature, however horrifying it appears from the outside, is actually a form of freedom. Nurgle would look at the Emperor and see, if the ascension theory is correct, something that has been fighting the tide for 10,000 years, something that has spent an eternity resisting the natural processes of deterioration, both in his own body and in the Imperium he sustains, something that is, in its own way, the ultimate expression of the denial of entropy. And Nurgle's response to that would not be simple antagonism. It would be something more like patient confidence, because entropy always wins. In the long run, in the very long run, everything breaks down, even gods, even ascended beings of psychic magnitude beyond ordinary comprehension. Everything that exists is subject to the passage of time, and time is ultimately Nurgle's province. The chaos god of disease and decay does not need to defeat the Emperor. He simply needs to wait, as he has always waited, confident that the universe's fundamental tendencies are working in his favor, regardless of what any individual entity achieves or resists. This is the most unsettling possible counter to an Emperor's return, because there is no psychic power or military force that can defeat an argument about the nature of time. The Emperor's return would be a victory over chaos in a specific moment. Nurgle's response would be to note that specific moments are, in the context of eternity, exactly as permanent as they sound, which is not very. Tzeentch is perhaps the chaos god most invested in controlling the outcome of the Emperor's return, because Tzeentch's entire nature is oriented toward manipulation of fate and the engineering of specific outcomes from complex systems. The Changer of Ways, the Architect of Fate, the Great Conspirator, these titles all reflect the same underlying truth. Tzeentch does not simply react to events, he orchestrates them. He has been planning for every contingency, including the Emperor's potential return, for as long as the Emperor has been on the throne. The specifically frightening thing about Tzeentch's involvement is that he does not want simple outcomes. A universe in which the Emperor remains dying on the throne, the Imperium slowly collapses, and chaos eventually wins, is not, from Tzeentch's perspective, an interesting universe. It is a boring one. Tzeentch does not want to win cleanly. He wants complexity. He wants plans, within plans, outcomes that transform themselves unexpectedly, victories that contain the seeds of new conflicts, a galaxy that is always changing in ways that keep the game interesting. An Emperor's return fits perfectly into a Tzeentchian framework, not as something to be prevented, but as something to be redirected. If the Emperor returns and the Imperium stabilizes and chaos is pushed back to a manageable level, that creates a new stable state from which Tzeentch can begin engineering the next phase of change. A universe in which the Emperor rules actively and the Chaos Gods are contained is a universe that is very different from what currently exists, and Tzeentch would find it interesting in ways the current situation no longer is. What Siensh would be working to ensure is that the Emperor's return happens in a form that is maximally useful to Chaos's long-term interests, not a complete victory for the Emperor, not a complete defeat, but something complicated. Something that creates new fault lines even as it resolves old ones. Something that leads to a next conflict more interesting than this one. Slaaneish's stake in the Emperor's return is the most personal and the most visceral. She who thirsts is the Chaos God most directly opposed to the Emperor's specific nature. Not because the Emperor represents martial virtue or nurturing acceptance or rational planning, but because the Emperor represents discipline, the specific quality of a consciousness that can endure 10,000 years of agony without breaking, without surrendering, without taking the easy path of simply letting go, is the quality most antithetical to Slaaneish's core value of indulgence and self-expression and the immediate satisfaction of every desire. Slaaneish's appetite for the souls of psychic beings is particularly relevant here. The Eldar are hunted by Slaanesh across the warp because their psychic capability makes their souls particularly nourishing. The Emperor, as the most powerful psychic human who has ever lived, represents a prize beyond anything Slaanesh has ever consumed, a soul of such extraordinary depth and complexity and power that its consumption would be, for Slaanesh, an experience of almost incomprehensible intensity. Slaanesh has been waiting for this. The slow death of the Emperor, the eventual dissolution of the throne's ability to sustain him, the moment when his psychic presence in the warp is no longer anchored by a physical body and becomes instead something that the currents of the immaterium can reach and consume. This is what she who thirsts has been anticipating, with a patience that is entirely out of character for a being, defined by the immediate gratification of desire. The fact that she has waited means she considers the prize worth waiting for. An emperor who ascends rather than dying, who transforms from a dying man into a fifth power in the warp, rather than becoming prey in that same domain, would be, from Slaanesh's perspective, the ultimate frustration. The prize that was almost hers, that she waited 10,000 years to claim, choosing to become something that can never be claimed in the way she had anticipated. That frustration would express itself in a very Slaaneshi way, not as cold strategic planning, but as an all-consuming, boundary-breaking rage that looks, from the outside, almost like love in its intensity. The four Chaos Gods, taken together, would not present a unified front against a returned emperor. They cannot. Their individual natures and competing interests make genuine cooperation essentially impossible for any sustained period. They might ally briefly in response to a specific threat, as they allied to corrupt Horus. That extraordinary act of cooperation that required all four of them working together toward a single goal, but holding such an alliance together against an emperor who was actively working to divide them, would be beyond their capacity. This is one of the strategic advantages the emperor would bring to any engagement with the Chaos Gods. He is one thing with one purpose. They are four things with four different purposes, held together by nothing more than the shared desire to see him fail, and the moment that desire is less compelling than their individual interests, which happens quickly in Chaos's internal politics, they become separate problems rather than a unified opposition. An emperor's return would not only transform the dynamics of the human chaos conflict. Every major faction in the galaxy would need to reassess its position in the light of the most significant change to the balance of power since the Horus heresy. The Aldari, divided as they are between the Craftworlds, the Ynnari, the Corsairs, the Harlequins, and the increasingly important Dark Eldar, have a relationship with the Emperor that is more complex than any human factions. The Aldari are older than the Imperium. Their seers have been watching the Emperor's psychic presence in the warp for the full 10,000 years of his internment, noting its changes, debating its trajectory, arguing about its implications for their own, already desperate situation. The Ynnari are the most immediately relevant. Ennead, the nascent Eldari god of the dead, the entity their race hopes will eventually awaken to defeat Slaanesh and free Eldari souls from the eternal hunger of she who thirsts, was partially awakened through a process that involved the Emperor's power. Guilliman's resurrection, which was facilitated by Ennead through the Ynnari, established a connection between the Emperor's divine spark and the emerging Eldari deity that subsequent lore has continued to develop. The possibility that an ascended emperor and a more fully awakened Yniad could become aligned powers, two relatively young divine entities working in parallel against the established chaos gods, is something certain Eldari. Seers have apparently perceived in the skein of fate. What that alignment would look like in practice, what it would cost both species, what compromises it would require from beings whose civilizations have been in intermittent conflict for millennia. These are questions the lore has not fully explored. What is clear is that any Eldari leader of genuine strategic vision would see the Emperor's return not as a threat the Imperium under active. Effective leadership would certainly be more dangerous to Eldari interests in a narrow political sense, but as the most significant defensive development in the galaxy's current era, the Chaos Gods are the existential threat to the Eldari. An emperor powerful enough to challenge those gods, even partially and imperfectly, serves Eldari interests in ways that outweigh any concern about Imperium expansion. The Necrons present a different calculation entirely. The Silent King Zarek, the ruler of the great Necron Empire 60 million years ago, returned to the galaxy in the current era after wandering in the void between galaxies, has allied with the Imperium and with the Tyranid hunters among the Eldari against the shared threat of the Hive fleets. His reason for return is the Tyranids, who threaten to consume the psychic substrate of the galaxy, the connection between the material universe and the warp that is the source of psychic power, and the environment in which the Chaos Gods exist. Zarek's perspective on the Emperor is that of an entity whose civilization is 60 million years old, looking at a being whose entire existence spans a mere 40,000 years. From that vantage point, the Emperor is extremely young. His ascension, if it occurs, is a very recent development in a very long timeline, and the question of whether he is an asset or a liability for the Necrons' goals depends entirely on whether his agenda aligns with theirs. The Necrons want to survive. They want to restore their biological bodies, reversed from the mechanical forms they were forced into 60 million years ago, or at minimum, to find some form of existence that is not the cold, isolated immortality of machines who cannot feel and cannot dream and cannot connect with the universe they were once part of. They want a galaxy that is stable enough for that long-term project to be possible, and they want the Tyranid threat, which would consume the very psychic dimension that might eventually offer them a path back to true life, to be contained. An emperor capable of sealing the Great Rift and stabilizing the warp serves all of these goals. The Necrons might be willing to offer significant assistance to a returned emperor's efforts, technical knowledge, military power, access to the pylon network that their civilization built across the galaxy, in exchange for his engagement with the Tyranid threat, on terms that take Necron interests seriously. The Tau are the faction most vulnerable to a returned emperor in the simple political sense, and also the faction most likely to misunderstand what his return means. The Tau believe in rational progress, in cooperative civilization, in the gradual extension of the greater good to more and more species. They are, in 40,000 terms, astonishingly optimistic for entities that exist in the same galaxy as everyone else. An Imperium, under active, effective imperial leadership, would be a more aggressive Imperium, from the Tau's perspective, more capable of coordinating military actions, more able to bring its enormous resources to bear against smaller civilizations on its frontiers. The Tau Empire, which has survived in part because the Imperium has been too distracted and fragmented to devote the resources needed to exterminate it, would face a more coherent existential threat. But the Tau might also, if approached correctly, if the right diplomatic channels could be established and maintained, if the Emperor's return produced not just a reinvigorated Imperium, but a more intelligent one, find in the new situation an opportunity. The Imperium, at its most rigid and dogmatic, has been the Tau's greatest obstacle. An Imperium guided by an emperor who was always, despite everything, a pragmatist, first, who built the Imperium not because he thought human supremacy was inherently good, but because he believed the alternatives were existentially worse, that might be capable of a relationship with the Tau that the Tau, current Imperium, could never manage. This is speculation extending beyond what the lore currently supports. But it is speculation in the spirit of what makes this universe deeply interesting. The recognition that the categories everyone uses, Imperium and Xenos, loyal and heretic, human and alien, are themselves historical constructions that could, under sufficiently different conditions, be renegotiated. There is one dimension of the Emperor's return that almost never receives the attention it deserves, and it is the most personal and the most fundamentally human aspect of the entire scenario. What it would be like for the Emperor himself. He has been conscious, in some form, for 10,000 years, aware, to some extent, of the passage of time, unable to communicate, unable to act directly in the physical world, unable to do anything except think and fight the endless psychic battle in the warp and sustain the functions that keep his Imperium alive. 10,000 years of that. Of watching, in whatever limited way his current state allows him to observe events, what became of everything he built. Of being unable to answer the questions that his children and his servants and the billions who pray to him desperately need answered. The specific quality of that awareness is something the lore has never fully examined. Perhaps wisely, it might be beyond what any author can render faithfully. But we can identify the key things that the Emperor, returning to something like full awareness and capacity for engagement, would need to confront. First, the heresy. He would need to sit with what happened, fully and without the defenses of action or purpose that a leader in the middle of a crisis can use to avoid processing the weight of their situation. Horus is gone, destroyed by the Emperor's own hand. But the other traitor Primarchs are still out there, in the eye of terror, serving the chaos gods they sold themselves to. Magnus the Red, whose single act of psychic communication destroyed the Webway project and set in motion the chain of events that led to the heresy. Magnus, who acted out of love, who was trying to help, who shattered everything with the best of intentions. Mortarion, and Angron, and Fulgrim, and Lorgar, and Perturabo, each of them, a being the Emperor created and named and, in his way, loved. What does the Emperor feel about them now? What would his return mean for them? Second, the failures. The Emperor was not infallible. He made decisions during the Great Crusade and during the heresy that, with the benefit of hindsight and 10,000 years of subsequent consequences, can be assessed as mistakes. The secrecy about the Webway project, the handling of Lorgar, whose religious devotion he punished rather than redirected, the failure to trust his sons, with the full picture of what he was working toward, the decision to confront Horus personally rather than authorizing others to do so, driven by the belief that only he could save his son, a belief that proved incorrect at catastrophic cost. A returned Emperor who could acknowledge these failures, who could bring to the conversation with Guilliman and with the other surviving loyal Primarchs, and with the Imperium at large, something resembling the honesty about his own role in the tragedy, would be a fundamentally different kind of leader from the one who built the Great Crusade. Whether he is capable of that honesty, after 10,000 years of whatever internal experience the throne has provided, is an open question. Third, the worship. He returns to a galaxy that worships him as a god. Billions of human beings whose entire understanding of their own significance and their place in the universe is structured around their relationship with the Divine Emperor. If he denies the worship, if he reasserts the imperial truth and insists he was never a god and the ecclesiarchy was wrong about everything, he does not simply disrupt an institution. He takes away from billions of people the framework that has allowed them to face their extraordinarily difficult lives with something resembling equanimity. The Sisters of Battle fight impossible odds and hold impossible lines because they truly believe the Emperor is with them. The Imperial Guard charges into the maws of Daemon engines and the blades of Chaos champions because they truly believe that death in the Emperor's service is not an ending. The ordinary citizens on 100,000 worlds endure privation and labor and suffering and the constant threat of violence because they truly believe that these things have meaning in the context of a divine plan. Take away the God, and you take away the meaning. You replace it with nothing, or with the cold comfort of rational materialism, and you leave people who have been shaped for 10,000 years to need something transcendent with nothing to hold on to. An emperor who understood this, who had spent 10,000 years watching what faith in him actually did for the people who held it, who had seen the living saints and the miraculous victories and the genuine supernatural effects that devotion to him had produced, might arrive at a position more nuanced than either simple endorsement of the ecclesiarchy, or simple reinstatement of the imperial truth. Something that acknowledged both the reality of the warp and the reality of human need for meaning. Something that was honest about what he was, without being brutally dismissive of what the faith in him had actually achieved. That would be a harder path than either simple option. It would require the patience to work through the theology with the people who have the most invested in the current version, to find a way to preserve what has been actually valuable about the imperial cult, while correcting the excesses and the abuses and the ways in which institutional religion has, as it always tends to in this setting, become an end in itself rather than a means. Whether the emperor who emerges from the golden throne is capable of that patience, whether 10,000 years of suffering has produced wisdom, or something else, is the question that every character in the setting who loves him, and every character who fears him, is simultaneously asking. The answer is one that only the emperor himself could provide, and in the grim darkness of the far future, he has not yet spoken. But the machine hums on. The light of the Astronomicon burns across the void, and something is waiting for the right moment to make itself known. We will be here when it does. There is something about this question, the question of the Emperor's return, that touches something deeper than lore discussion normally reaches. And I want to sit with that for a moment before we close, because I think it is worth acknowledging. Warhammer 40,000, at its best, is not really about space marines or daemon princes or ancient machines designed for war. It is about the price of survival, about what a species does when the universe it inhabits is actively trying to destroy it, when the threats are real, the costs are enormous, and there is no option that does not require sacrifice. About whether the act of surviving in a way that requires you to become something monstrous to accomplish it is, in some deep sense, a form of losing even while you technically win. The Emperor on the Golden Throne is the setting's most concentrated expression of that question. He is a being who chose or was forced. The distinction matters less than people sometimes think to sacrifice himself completely for a cause. Not merely his life, not merely his comfort or his freedom, his entire future, every year that might have been, every relationship he might have had, every thought he might have completed uninterrupted, every choice he might have made with full agency and full information. All of it traded for the continuation of the species he built his existence around protecting. Was it worth it? Is 10,000 years of agony in a golden machine worth the survival of humanity, given everything humanity is? Given the imperium it has become, given the atrocities committed in the Emperor's name, given the suffering endured by the billions who live inside the system he built? These are not questions with easy answers. They are not questions the setting answers for you. They are questions the setting places in front of you and then leaves you alone with, which is exactly what good science fiction does. If the Emperor returns, that question does not go away. It just takes a new form. Because whatever he returns as will be shaped by that 10,000 years of paid cost, and the Imperium he returns to will need to reckon with the full weight of what those costs produced. Not just the survival that was purchased, but the price that was paid for it. Every soul sacrificed at the throne, every war fought in his name, every world burned in the service of his Imperium's survival. Every human being who lived and died in the grim darkness of the far future without being given a choice about any of it. The Emperor's return is not the end of that reckoning. If anything, it is its beginning. A being of that intelligence and that awareness, stepping out of the machine and looking at what was built while he was unable to speak that moment, is the moment at which someone finally has to answer for all of it. Whether anyone is actually prepared for that answer is the most interesting question in 40,000. And we will be right here when it arrives to work through every layer of what it means. Thank you for spending this time here. The Emperor protects. Until next time.